Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Maseches Beitzah Daf Chav Ches contains two very short mishnayos. The first mishnah is on the topic of somebody who wishes to purchase meat and how he's allowed to do that. We've been discussing that for a few daf. Now we'll get into how he can weigh the meat without violating the isser of weighing and measuring on Yom Tov. The Gemara will get into a number of details about the halachos of weighing and measuring. And then we'll get to our next mishnah, which will discuss sharpening a knife. We'll cover Yom Tov in order to be able to use on Yom Tov, when one is allowed to do that on Yom Tov, what types of sharpening are permitted and what types of sharpening are forbidden. The Gemara will expound on the topic of the machlokes about what activities are permitted to prepare food for Yom Tov. On Yom Tov is something as far away as sharpening the knife. Does that go into the permissible list of activities for Yom Tov? So let's begin the Mishnah. The daf starts with a Mishnah which introduces machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, but how you're allowed to weigh meat in order to buy it from the butcher on Shabbos. Now, we know you're not allowed to weigh meat directly. That would be considered to be a weekday activity. That's over the Dechol. But Rabbi Yehuda says what you can do is you can weigh it against a kli of some sort whose weight you know. So the way that they weighed things, of course, was that they had a scale which was a balance, two plates suspended across a fulcrum, and they would put the meat on one side and they would put weights, counterweights with a known weight on the other side. And when they balanced evenly, then you would know the weight of the meat that you were trying to weigh. Now you can't do that. And what you can do is take a kli. So Rabbi Yehuda says you're allowed to take a kli or a knife or something and use it as a counterweight. And if you know the weight, then you can do that. The Chachamim say you are not allowed to look at a scale at all. So the Gemara says, what's with that expression? The Gemara begins and says, what's with that expression, not allowed to look at a scale at all? What does that mean? Now, why don't you just say it's forbidden to use the scale even with using a kli as a counterweight? So the Gemara answers, he says in the name of Shmuel, even if you want to just put meat on the scale in order to keep it away from mice because it's suspended, in the air, that's forbidden. You're not allowed to do anything on a scale. Anything to do with the scale is considered to be over the Dechol, weekday activities. Whereas Ravidi Bar Avin says that that's only if it's actually set up to weigh, that's it's suspended on its fulcrum. Otherwise, it would be okay. Now, the Gemara continues with a list of halachas about weighing here. The Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel that if you have an expert butcher who is able to tell the weight by holding the meat in his hand and holding a counterweight in his other hand and comparing the two weights, that would be forbidden because that would be something he would do even during the week. Again, all these activities are forbidden under activities that you would do as a weekday activity. So that would be forbidden also. The Gemara says also, Rav Chia Rashi adds that if you can, Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel also says that if you can weigh it, if an expert can weigh it in water, that is, he can place the meat in a cup of water and see by its displacement how much it weighs, that's also forbidden. Again, it's a weak activity because he would do that during the week. Whereas Rashi says you're not allowed to make a handle in the meat. When a butcher would give meat, he would cut a hole in it so that the person who's carrying it could put his hand through it and use it as a handle. That's also forbidden. Ravina says you are though allowed to make the hole with your finger, so you would be allowed to poke a hole in the meat in order to be able to do that. The Gemara then says further, what you are allowed to do is to make a siman in the meat. That is, in order to send meat from one place to another, you have to make sure that it did not get confused with non-kosher meat, so people would make a certain sign on it. So you are allowed to make that. So the Gemara says like Rabba by Rav Huna used to make it as a triangle shape. That would be permitted. Okay, now the Gemara quotes an activity of Rav Chia and Rav Shimon, the son of Rebbe, Rav Shimon bar Rebbe. So the Gemara says what they used to do is when they wanted to split up a piece of meat, so they would take the meat and they would cut it and put each half on the scale, and then they would see when they were equal weights, and that's the way they would know that they were dividing it equally. So that's an activity that they would do on Yom Tov. So the Gemara says, who does that feel like in our Mishnah? Doesn't feel like Rabbi Yehuda, and doesn't feel like the Rabbanan. Why doesn't it fit with Rabbi Yehuda? He only said you're allowed to weigh it against a kli or a knife. To weigh it against another piece of meat is something you would do during the week. If you have two partners wanting to split up a piece of meat, they would do this procedure during the week. So therefore that's more over the Dechol, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda would say that that's usher. The Rabbanan would for sure say it's usher. They say you're not allowed to do anything as far as weighing goes. So the Gemara says that they were holding like a third opinion, and that's Rav Yeshua. And Rav Yeshua says that you are allowed to weigh one piece of meat against another piece of meat. Now the Gemara wants to show that the halacha is like Rav Yeshua, and the Gemara goes to a different topic, and that is the topic of weighing out the meat of a bechor, an animal which is a bechor. So a bit of introduction here. The halacha is that although a bechor which gets a mum belongs to its owner, and you're allowed to eat it, if you wanted to sell it, you could not sell it in a butcher shop, and you could not weigh it with scales. And that's because it's a bizoyon to hektish. It is degrading to hektish to sell it like a regular piece of meat. Now, other pasul karbanos, psulei mikdashim, that you redeemed, you are allowed to sell because you wanted to sell for a higher price because the profits will go to hektish. But a bechor and meiser as well, the profits go to the owner. They're not considered to be hektish property. You don't have to redeem it and buy other karbanos with it. It just belongs to the owner. But because it has some residual kedusha from being a bechor and being a meiser, you cannot sell it in a butcher shop. Now, however, though, there is a brisa which says that you are allowed to weigh one piece against another piece in order to determine its weight as part of the selling procedure. So that would seem to be in accordance with Rabbi Yeshua. So you see that this supports Rabbi Yeshua, even though Rabbi Yeshua was discussing weighing on Yom Tov, and this is discussing weighing a bechor, but they both have limited halachas to what you're allowed to do. The brisa therefore that says you're allowed to weigh a piece against a piece for bechor should also say the same thing as far as weighing on Yom Tov. So Abai says not true. It's not necessarily that one thing has anything to do with the other, because there are different reasons. The svara of bechor is that it's bizayin hektish. So if you weigh one piece of meat against another piece of meat, that's bizayin hektish. This here, where it's Yom Tov, might not be bizayin hektish. So even though Rav Yeshua says you're allowed to weigh one piece of meat against another here, that's because here it's not bizayin hektish. It could be that in the case of bechoros he would say that it's forbidden, and therefore the two opinions don't agree. Well, even the Rabbanan themselves, the ones who say they hear that it's usher, it could be that they will say that the bizayin hektish is not a problem, because there's no over the dechol issue. Now over here you have two partners that are weighing meat against each other. Partners weighing one piece of meat against the others, that's something that commonly happens during the weekday, so that would be over the dechol, and therefore they would say that that's usher. But it could be that as far as bechor, where you have somebody trying to buy a piece of meat from another, it's not normal to buy a piece of meat from another individual by weighing one piece of meat against another, and therefore they possibly would say that that's permitted and it's not considered to be over the dechol. Now the Gemara has a question here though. Why are Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe weighing a piece of meat against each other? That sounds like they are very strict with each other to make sure that none gets more than the other. But we know that that's not true, because it was an incident in which 7 fish were delivered to Rebbe's house, and they were split up between Rabbi Chia, his Talmud, and Rabbi Shimon, his son. But Rabbi Chia ended up with 5 pieces of meat, and Rabbi Shimon only ended up with 2, and he didn't care. So you see that they're not so they're not so strict with each other. Someone says you have to change the story. It couldn't be the two of them. Either it was Rav Chia together with Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yaisi, or if it was Rav Shimon bar Rebbe, then it was together with Bar Kapara. But it couldn't be Rav Shimon and Rabbi Chia. Okay, now we get to our next Mishnah, and this discusses sharpening a knife. So the Mishnah discusses 2 cases of sharpening. The Mishnah says sharpening a knife on a it just says regular sharpening, it doesn't say on what. Then it discusses sharpening a knife by scraping it against another knife. So sharpening, it says you're not allowed to do on Yom Tov, but scraping it against another knife you are allowed to do. The Gemara introduces the statement of Rav Huna that says there's another way of sharpening a knife, and that's scraping it against a wooden sharpener. So we have 3 things. We have scraping against a sharpening stone, we have scraping against a wooden sharpener, and we have scraping against another knife. Now the Gemara says there are 2 possible reasons you may scrape a knife against any of these things. One would be to sharpen the knife, another would be to rub off fats and oils that are stuck on that knife itself. The Gemara quotes a statement of Rabbi Yehuda named Shmuel that says that there's a difference, that it's permitted to rub off the oils. It's forbidden to sharpen it, but it's permitted to rub off the oils. Now the Gemara wants to know what case is he referring to, and the Gemara is going to go through 4 options over here. The Gemara first wants to say he's in the statement of Rav Huna, that there's a difference between a sharpening stone made out of stone and a sharpening device made out of wood. And on that he was saying that you're allowed to rub it against he was referring to the first phrase there where we said that it's forbidden to sharpen a knife against the stone. He was saying that there's a difference between sharpening it or trying to scrape off the oil. So Gemara says that would imply that against wood it's permitted either way. Then the Gemara says, well, maybe he was referring to the statement that it's permitted to rub a knife against wood, and he was saying only that's only to rub off the oil but not to sharpen it, in which case rubbing it against the sharpening stone would be forbidden for either purpose. Then the Gemara says actually the 3rd and 4th possibility are that he could have been referring to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said you're allowed to sharpen. You're not allowed to sharpen, but you are allowed to rub against another knife. So it could be he was referring to the phrase that you're allowed to sharpen, and he was saying it could be he was referring to the phrase where you're not allowed to sharpen it, and he was saying that you're not allowed to sharpen it, but you are allowed to scrape off the fats and that would be implying that if it was rubbing against another knife, you'd be allowed to even sharpen it against the knife, not only scrape off the fats. Or he could be referring to the end case where it said where you are allowed to rub it against another knife, and he was saying that's only to scrape off the fat, but not to sharpen it, and that would imply that to actually sharpen it against a sharpening device, you would not be allowed to not to rub off the fats and not to sharpen it. All of these would be forbidden. Okay, now the Gemara goes further. The Gemara says that Rav Chisda says that this Mishnah does not seem to fit with Rabbi Yehuda, and the Gemara introduces machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim about what types of activities are permitted for the sake of preparing food. According to the Chachamim, it's only something which directly is involved in food preparing. Rabbi Yehuda allows even what's called machshirei ochal nefesh, that's a step before the actual preparing of the food. Sharpening the knife in order to use the knife to prepare the food would be machshirei ochal nefesh, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda would say that that's permitted. This Mishnah seems to imply that that is forbidden. So Gemara says, what's the halacha? Rava said to Rabbi Chisda, should we say in your name that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, that even machshirei ochal nefesh are permitted? So the Gemara says that he responded and he said, may it be Hashem's will that you should say this and all other great things in my name. Certainly it's a very good thing to say. Okay, now the Gemara brings two related stories. My sister Nehemiah, son of Beitzah, said, I was standing in front of Rava, and I saw that he was rubbing a knife against the ridge, the lip of a basket, and I said, are you doing that in order to rub off the fat or in order to sharpen it? And he said, I'm doing it to rub off the fat. But I saw that he was really doing it in order to sharpen it. That means that he held that the halacha is that you are allowed to sharpen it, and he held like Rabbi Yehuda, but he held it was halacha of ein moirin kain. You don't tell people that that's the halacha. That's why he tried to deceive me and say that he was only rubbing off the fat. Very similar story happened with Abaye. He said he was standing in front of Mar. Mar probably refers to Rabbah, who was his Rebbe, and he was rubbing a knife against a stone of a grinding mill. And I asked him, are you sharpening it or are you rubbing off the fat? He said, I'm rubbing off the fat. And I saw, though, that he was sharpening it. And again, the reason is because he held it was halacha, but ein moirin kain. Okay, now the Gemara goes to the topic of inspecting a shechita knife. So the Gemara asks, what is the halacha? Are you allowed to show a shechita knife to a chacham? The halacha is that a shaychet was obligated always to show his knife to a chacham before he shechted with it to make sure that it wasn't nicked. The Gemara wants to know, are you allowed to do that on Yom Tov? So the Gemara says, Rav Mari, brother of Bizna, said you're allowed to. The Rabbanan said you're not allowed to. Rav Yosef said, though, that a Talmid Chacham is allowed to paskin on his own knife, and then he can lend it to other shachtim so that they could use that in order to be able to shecht. Now, Rav Yosef points out that if you have a knife which is not nicked, but it is not sharp, its sharpness has faded, it became dull, you're allowed to sharpen that on Yom Tov, and that's only if it was still sharp enough that you could still cut with it, you just had to use too much force. If you couldn't cut with it at all, then it's too much effort to go and sharpen it, then you would not be allowed to sharpen it any further. Yeah, the Gemara brings some further halachos here. Rav Chisda said, and possibly Rav Yosef said, if you have a knife which got a nick and has to be smoothed out, or if you have a spit that its tip broke off. The spit was a metal rod which you used to poke through a piece of meat so you could hang it over the fire. If the tip broke off, you can't poke it through the meat. Or if you have an oven or a stove that the insides kind of fell down and you have to clear them out, all these things, are you allowed to do them on Yom Tov or not? As part of the machlokes between Rav Yehuda and the Rabbanan as to whether machshiri ochal nefesh are permitted on Yom Tov or not. According to Rav Yehuda, machshiri ochal nefesh are permitted, you would be allowed to do these. According to the Rabbanan, you would not be allowed to fix these things. The Gemara quotes a Beitzah at length, which spells out this machlokes. The Beitzah says that according to the Chachamim, which is the Tanakama, you're allowed to do ochal nefesh only, and not allowed to do anything else. And Rav Yehuda says you're allowed to do machshiri ochal nefesh. And the Beitzah explains what the reasoning is. It's based on the pasuk which says, "V'yam rishon v'karkadosh v'yam mashvim v'karkadosh yalachem kol melacha lo yasav lahem ach asher yachal l'chol nefesh hu levada yeyasal lachem." So it says hu levada yeyasal lachem, something which is for food, that alone you can do for you. So according to Chachamim, the Xer is from hu. We say it says hu levade, that minimizes it. Only actual ochal nefesh requirements, not machshiri ochal nefesh. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it says yasal lachem lachem mechal tzarchechem, you and anything you need, you're allowed to do all of those things. Versus what do they each do with the other one's drasha? So the Gemara says lachem, according to the Chachamim, will mean only something that you need, not something that an akum or a nachri needs. That's to limit. Rav Yehuda will say that you're right. Hu does minimize it, and lachem does include other things though. So you need a balance between hu and lachem. So what is that? Machshirin, any preparation food which you could have, any preparation activity which you could have done before Yom Tov, you would not be permitted to do on Yom Tov. That is what is left out, what is excluded by the term hu. What's included by the term lachem is things which you could not have done before Yom Tov, even if they are only machshirei ochel nefesh. Okay, more halachas on the subject. Of Yehuda, the name of Shmuel, says if you have a spit which was bent out of shape, you're not allowed to fix it. Mer says, obviously, of course, you're not allowed to fix anything on Yom Tov. And Mer says, no, the chiddush here is that you could fix it with your hand. It doesn't require a major strenuous activity, but you're still not allowed to do that. Next halacha of Yehuda and Shmuel. If you have a spit which you use to roast meat, it becomes muktzah. It's disgusting, it's gross, it's filthy and messy and oily afterwards, so you're not allowed to move it. Some Amoraim disagree. Rav Ada bar Ava in the name of Rav Malkio, or perhaps Rav Malkio in the name of Rav Ada bar Ava, depending on the Yersa, say that you're allowed to kick it into the corner. Chibar Ashi, the Rav Huna says that it's only if there's a concise of meat on it, so therefore it still has meat on it, so it's not muktzah. Ravina says it's not muktzah for a different reason. It's a spike, and anything sharp is a potential instrument of causing harm if you leave it lying around. Therefore, you're allowed to move it around. You're allowed to move it away. Similar halacha we see about thorns that are in Rosh Hashanah in the public domain. You're allowed to move them even in Rosh Hashanah. You don't have to worry about carrying on Shabbos. Now, the Gemara, having mentioned Rav Malkio, points out that there are two Chachamim. There's Rav Malkio and Rav Malkiyah, and they each said three things, and we don't want to confuse them. So the Gemara has two versions of who said what. Rav Chanan Breder Rav Ika has a list, and Rav Papa says there is a rule to remember it, but it doesn't quite match up with the list. Rav Chanan Breder Rav Ika's list is the halacha about the spit, halacha that a woman who's wealthy and hires a lot of servants should still do some household work herself so that she shouldn't be idle. And the halacha that if a child has hairs, so he's considered to be an adult, but even if he has hair follicles that are well developed but there's no hair in it, you assume that he had hair and they fell out. Those are the three halachos. The halacha of the spit, the servants, and the hairs, those are all Rav Malkiyo. The halachas of Rav Malkiyo are the halacha that if you're giving a haircut to a non-Jew, you have to stop short of his tuft of hair that he leaves for Avodah Zarah. You can't cut all the way up to there because you're helping him with his Avodah Zarah. You also cannot put ashes on a healing wound which will cause a tattoo. It'll get stuck under the skin and cause inking. And he explains the reason that Gvinas Akum is aser. Gvinas Akum is cheese from Akum, that's forbidden. His reasoning for that is because they used to smear it with pig fat. And those are the three things of Rav Malkiah. Now, Rav Papa says the rules as follows. Anything which is a masnisa, a brisa, was said by Rav Malkiah. Anything which is a masnisin, anything which is masnisin or masnisa was said by Rav Malkiah. So that's a mishnah or a brisa. Anything which is a statement of an amora, that's said by Rav Malkiah. And your sign is Malkisa, Malkiah. Okay, now, the one thing that's different between them is the halacha of the shevcha. The halacha of the shevcha, the servants, so according to Rav Chanan Breder Rav Ika, that was said by Rav Malkiah, but according to Rav Papa, that was said by Rav Malkiah.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.